The Subcommittee on Space will come to order. Good morning. Welcome to today's hearing entitled An Update on the Space Launch System in Orion, Monitoring the Development of the Nation's Deep Space Exploration Capabilities. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biography, and truth and testimony disclosure for today's witnesses. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I would like to welcome everyone to our hearing, and particularly our witnesses. Thank you for your appearance here today. Anyone who pays attention to the media at all is no doubt aware of the spectacular launch of the Orion crew vehicle last week. I want to congratulate Mr. Gerstenmaier and his entire team at NASA, as well as the teams at Lockheed Martin and United Launch Alliance for an outstanding test flight. While we will hear today about the preliminary results from this test, the scientists and engineers at NASA will continue to analyze the data for quite some time. I look forward to hearing more about the progress of this analysis in the future. The successful test launch of Orion demonstrates that we're on the right track for sending humans back to the moon and Mars within our lifetimes. Across the nation, people were watching with the same hope and pride that all Americans had in the early days of our space program. In my congressional district, children were bused to the Stennis Space Center to watch a live feed of the launch. Events like this are what we need to inspire the next generation of astronauts and engineers. And SLS is a giant leap forward in making America the leader in space once again. The tremendous ongoing work at NASA and our industry partners is beginning to produce tangible results. The nation can be proud of what was accomplished last week. It was certainly a job well done. The purpose of our hearing today is to examine the challenges and opportunities facing the Space Launch System and Orion programs. It is no secret that this committee is concerned that the support within NASA for the SLS and Orion is not matched by the administration. While this lack of commitment is somewhat puzzling, it is not at all surprising. The President has made clear that he does not believe space exploration is a priority for the nation and has allowed political appointees within the administration to manipulate the course of our human spaceflight program. These decisions should be made by the scientists, engineers, and program managers that have decades of experience in human spaceflight. As everyone here knows, this is not an easy field. We cannot ramp up capability or prepare for these missions overnight. Space exploration requires a dedication to advanced preparation and research, and this committee and this Congress are dedicated to supporting that requirement. The administration has consistently requested large reductions for these programs, despite the insistence of Congress that they be priorities. Most recently, the President's budget for fiscal year 2015 included a request to reduce these programs by over $330 million compared to the fiscal year 2014 enacted appropriation. Additionally, in the 2013, 2014, 2015 budget request, the administration asked for reductions of $175 million, $87 million, and $144 million, respectively, for the Orion program relative to the enacted appropriations. Had Congress agreed to the request, Orion and the SLS would have incurred hundreds of millions of dollars in reductions and would likely face significant delays and mass layoffs. Thankfully, Congress listened to the program managers and industry partners to ensure these programs were appropriately funded. Congress has once again demonstrated support for the SLS and Orion by providing funding well above the President's budget request in the omnibus for fiscal year 2015. While these priority programs may not enjoy support within the administration, they certainly do from Congress. Let me be very clear, on my watch, Congress will not agree to gutting the SLS program, not now, not any time in the foreseeable future. The human exploration program at NASA has been plagued with instability from constantly changing requirements, budgets, and missions. We cannot change our program of record every time there's a new president. This committee is consistent and unwavering in its commitment to human exploration, a tradition that I appreciate and I'm confident will continue into the future. While this hearing is certainly an opportunity for us to celebrate the great progress of the SLS and Orion programs, particularly last week's test flight, the committee has ongoing concerns about the challenges facing these vital programs. In a letter to the NASA Administrator, Chairman Smith and I expressed our concerns for potential delays of Exploration Mission 1 that has been slated for 2017 and is now potentially delayed to as late as fiscal year 2018. The administration's letter back to the committee was strangely unresponsive and did not inspire a lot of confidence in NASA's ability to meet the original timelines laid out. Congress needs answers to these questions. At the very least, we need to know What are the true funding needs and schedule expectations for the development of the SLS and Orion programs, and is NASA on track to meet these expectations? In addition to consistently submitting insufficient funding requests, the administration also appears to be limiting the usefulness of funding it does receive. For example, the administration's treatment of termination liability prevents hundreds of millions of dollars from being used for meaningful development work. Also, the committee has learned that the administration has given direction to the SLS and Orion programs to plan spending rates consistent with the President's budget requests instead of the higher continuing resolution level. Combined, these efforts are undermining the successful development of these national priority programs. In a recent report titled Space Launch System, Resources Needed to be Matched to Requirements to Decrease Risk and Support Long-Term Affordability, the Government Accountability Office highlighted technical and schedule risks that NASA had not previously brought to the attention of the committee. Specifically, GAO states that, quote, according to the program's risk analysis, the agency's current funding plan for SLS may be $400 million short of what the program needs to launch by 2017. It was surprising for the committee to hear about this shortfall, since the administrator had previously testified that, quote, if we added $300 million to the SLS program, you wouldn't know it. It is not unreasonable for Congress to expect the administration to be straightforward about the risk and costs associated with national priority programs. As we look to continue pushing towards Mars, we must talk honestly and realistically about these programs and what we can accomplish with them. We want to be partners moving forward, not competitors. Unfortunately, the administration has simply not allowed for that cooperation. The test last week of Orion was an important milestone in the future of America's space program. It was a fully commercial mission licensed by the Federal Aviation Administration and conducted by the private sector. In the future, Orion and SLS will serve as the tip of the spear for our nation's space exploration program. Recently, some have argued that the government shouldn't be involved in space exploration at all and suggest that the private sector alone is capable of leading us into the cosmos. I certainly hope that this will someday be possible, but right now, space exploration requires government support. This is a worthwhile investment for the taxpayer. It inspires the next generation of explorers to pursue science, technology, engineering, and math, advances U.S. soft power and international relations, reinforces our aerospace industrial base, increases economic competitiveness, and advances our national security interests. Orion and SLS, the vanguard of our nation's space program, are key to advancing these interests. I look forward to hearing from Mr. Gerstenmaier and Ms. Chaplain today about the challenges and opportunities facing these important programs. I now recognize the ranking member from Maryland, Ms. Edwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, and welcome to our witnesses. I want to join Chairman Palazzo in congratulating NASA, Lockheed, United Launch Alliance, and the entire government and contractor team on successfully conducting the exploration flight test, EFT-1, of the Orion capsule last week. I think it was truly exciting, and I know that around the country and around the world, there were many of us looking on television for the first time in a long time at a U.S. space program that really is very forward-looking. The flight subjected Orion and its systems to the rigors of outer space beyond low Earth orbit to test key systems, verify the Orion design, reduce technical risk, and test recoverability operations. Mr. Chairman, I believe that this test flight shows Americans that tangible progress is in fact being made on returning humans to exploration beyond our Earth's neighborhood, and a goal that this committee and the Congress as a whole have embraced through multiple NASA authorization acts, despite some of the challenges that the chairman laid out. I would also note that I think we were in this hearing room just 3 years ago wondering whether Orion was really going to be possible or not, and I think that we have addressed that question in what is a remarkably short period of time. And so while I look forward to looking at the challenges and taking on some of those challenges, I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that we have great capacity and that the American people can get greatly excited by that, and I think then lead those of us who are the policymakers to do the right thing when it comes to robustly funding our exploration program. The development of the Space Launch System, SLS, and the Orion crew vehicle are necessary next steps in reaching our goals for human exploration human space exploration, including the long-term goal of sending humans to the surface of Mars, as stated in our bipartisan House-passed NASA Authorization Act of 2014. And so I also thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing so we can obtain an update on the status of the SLS and Orion programs. And it was indeed just those 3 years ago that we sat in this room and we were pressing NASA for a decision on a final design of the SLS rocket. There was great debate between the administration and this committee and the Congress. And I think today we're going to hear of the program's approval to enter into the full-scale development as some of us had envisioned. This is indeed a significant accomplishment, even in the midst of major challenges, especially those related to constrained budgets. Very often, Congress has been supportive of SLS Orion and has appropriated funding above the President's request, as the Chairman has indicated. I don't know that I necessarily share the Chairman's view about where all the faults lie. However, the programs have been challenged by the flat funding levels provided for SLS and Orion over the past years, a situation that departs significantly from the typical funding growth profiles of major development programs. And that's why we've recognized the critical need to authorize a robust top-line funding level for NASA in the 2013 Democratic NASA authorization bill that included healthy increases for the exploration program. The National Academies Committee, in fact, recently released its report on human space exploration and also recognized that sending humans to the surface of Mars would include and require sustained increases. They said, and I quote, "Increasing NASA's budget to allow increasing the human spaceflight budget by 5% per year would enable pathways with potentially viable mission rates, greatly reducing technical, cost, and schedule risk." End quote. And so, Mr. Chairman, we can work together to overcome these challenges. And as we work over this next Congress to reauthorize NASA, I look forward to working with you to ensure that this committee authorizes the appropriations that the SLS and Orion programs require to achieve the expeditious development and testing of these vehicles for their use at the earliest possible date, and that we obtain a human exploration roadmap to focus the SLS and Orion systems on long-term mission goals. And because when I see the excitement of the FT-1 test flight as demonstrated by the flight's coverage as a leading media story, I think in fact it did lead the broadcast news, I'm reminded that the SLS and Orion programs really do belong to the American public and that they will in fact embrace them. We need to honor this thirst for exploration. And finally, though the 113th Congress is rapidly drawing to a close, I encourage our colleagues in the Senate to seek quick passage of the House-passed NASA Authorization Act of 2014, and so that NASA and its industry contractors, all of them, have the direction and stability needed to plan for continued progress. And then finally, I will just reiterate what I have said many times before, and that is we cannot have one set of goals for NASA and for our human exploration programs and then not match those goals with the resources that are required to commit to the work on a timely basis. It's unfair to the agency, it's unfair to contractors, and it is a false expectation for the public. And with that, I yield back, and I look forward to hearing the testimony today.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I want to congratulate Bill Gerstenmaier and those at NASA and also at Lockheed Martin and United Launch Alliance, who I see are represented in the room today, on a spectacular flight test last week of the Orion crew vehicle. I know a lot of hard work went into making that test flight successful. At a fundamental level, space exploration, the mission of NASA, is about inspiration. This inspiration fuels our desire to push the boundaries of what is possible and to reach beyond our own pale blue dot. The successful Orion launch last week is one step in a long journey. The purpose of today's hearing is simple. We wish to send a loud and clear message that space exploration is NASA's #1 priority, and last week's test flight demonstrated many firsts. We are also here to ensure the next steps in this long journey are on track and will be just as successful. There is bipartisan support within Congress that NASA stay on track with the Orion crew vehicle and space launch system, including the omnibus appropriations bill that we plan to vote on tomorrow. The Orion and SLS are essential elements for astronauts to eventually travel beyond low Earth orbit. The omnibus appropriations bill made public last night is the latest example of congressional support for these programs. Funded well above the President's budget request, the SLS and Orion are receiving the resources they need to ensure their success. Fortune favors the bold. Last week's test flight was necessary to answer the naysayers and critics who claim that America's best days on the frontier of space are behind us. Last week's mission answered those critics. The Apollo program demonstrated that we could reach the moon, and Orion and SLS will ensure that America continues a sustained series of missions as a spacefaring nation for decades to come. The technologies that are developed for these programs exemplify our greatest breakthroughs and demonstrate American ingenuity. We must continue to push forward. Great nations do great things. Everyone in today's hearing wants to ensure that the first flag flying on the surface of Mars is planted by an American astronaut. And they will have arrived there on board an Orion crew vehicle propelled by the Space Launch System. Let's work together to make that happen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. Before I introduce our witnesses, I would be remiss if I did not point out that we are missing one this morning, NASA Chief Financial Officer David Radzanowski. The CFO or his designee was invited to participate in today's hearing to answer questions regarding NASA's budget, development, and guidance. Unfortunately, despite numerous invitations and attempts to secure his attendance, the administration refused to make him available. Mr. Radzanowski holds a Senate-confirmed position at NASA and is obliged to testify before the agency's oversight committees. We are aware of the many demands on his schedule, and for that reason, the committee was willing to allow any other employee from the CFO's office to appear. Unfortunately, NASA prohibited any other CFO representative from appearing today. This is unfortunate because Mr. Gerstenmaier may not be the appropriate person at NASA to explain many of the policies and practices being advanced by the CFO's office. I look forward to Mr. Radzanowski's appearance before the committee in the near future to answer our questions. At this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness today is Mr. Bill Gerstenmaier. Mr. Gerstenmaier started his work with NASA in 1977 as a researcher on aeronautics. Today, he is the Associate Administrator for the Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate at NASA headquarters here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Gerstenmaier has received many awards for his work on space exploration, including the Distinguished Executive Presidential Rank Award, the National Space Club von Braun Award, the Space Transportation Leadership Award, and several NASA awards. He received a Bachelor of Science in Aeronautical Engineering from Purdue University and a Master of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Toledo. Our second witness, Ms. Cristina Chaplain, has been a U.S. Government Accountability Office employee for 23 years and currently serves as Director of Acquisition and Sourcing Management at GAO. In this capacity, she is responsible for GAO assessments of military space acquisitions and NASA. She has led reviews of the Space Launch System, the International Space Station, and the James Webb Space Telescope, among others. Prior to her current position, Ms. Chaplain worked with GAO's Financial Management and Information Technology teams. She received her Bachelor's in International Relations from Boston University and a Master's degree in Journalism from Columbia University. Thanks again to our witnesses for being here today. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. I now recognize Mr. Gerstenmaier for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'd like to, again, thank you on behalf of the entire team that works in the exploration program. And I'd like to start off my testimony with some videos and pictures that we provided earlier. These videos and images capture the work that's been accomplished in the exploration program, and I'll narrate some of the video as it's shown. So if we could start the video, please. Again, the program is made up of three major components: ground systems operations down in Florida, which is preparing the launch site. These are the images that you're seeing here on the screen. Again, the purpose of these video is to show you how much work is actually being accomplished kind of behind the scenes. You can see the launch of EFT-1, but you don't often get a chance to see all the work that's occurring at the various field centers and the various areas that are making these things happen. This is the Delta IV. There were some Delta IV images showing up down at the Kennedy Space Center. This is the fabrication and manufacturing of the Orion capsule that was launched on the EFT test flight. Again, you get to see the technicians, the folks at the various centers working to make all this activity happen. It's not only in Florida, but it's also in Houston, where the control center team got to monitor the capsule, actually send some commands to the capsule. There was a team in Florida that also monitored the launch, so they got to participate in that activity and participate in the Orion capsule activity. Again, you can see the capsule coming together. Some of the hardware came from the Marshall Space Flight Center that was actually manufactured. The interface between the Delta IV rocket and the Orion capsule came from the Marshall Space Flight Center. So again, I would say this is an entire NASA team coming together to make this happen. This is some work and again in Florida, preparing for the capsule, and also down at MAF at the Michoud Assembly Facility, where the SLS will be put together. I think you were there for the vertical assembly weld center that got put together that will manufacture the large external tanks. That activity is occurring. There's several sections all ready to be test welded next January, this in about a month. That's moved forward. Also, the test was a substantial amount of test occurred before the test to make sure the parachute systems would work. We're preparing for the future exploration activities to look at the asteroid redirect mission. And now you can see some of the work of actually, transporting the capsule out to the launch pad to be integrated eventually with the Delta IV rocket. So again, I think the important message and takeaway from all these images is there's a tremendous amount of work going on. It's being accomplished pretty much on schedule. There's challenges through this work. It is not easy work. The teams are very dedicated. They're working very hard to make this things occur. And I think the results of the test flight show evidence that we're making significant and substantial progress as we move forward. The next video that's getting queued up now is the actual video from the test flight. Many of you got to either see it in person or you got to see it on television. Again, I'll describe some of the activities that occurred there. And again, the point here is that this test flight didn't come about just as a happenstance. There was lots of preparation before. We did many drop tests of the parachute systems. We did many recovery activities. We've done the abort system testing down at White Sands earlier, again, to verify and make sure that when we took this test, we were ready to go do this test. So we didn't have all the questions answered. There was still significant risk with this test. There were still things that we could not test in any other environment other than the test flight. But this test flight confirmed that those other pieces, at least first look, fit well, and we understand the data, and things look very good from an overall standpoint. Again, a lot of folks got to witness this. It was exciting to see people show up in Florida to be there. As you talked about in some of your opening remarks, the encouragement to the science, technology, engineering, and math students is really strong. To interact with many of the students down in Florida was really exciting for me to see their enthusiasm to move forward. This is the actual launch activity. That umbilical up at the top was unique to Orion. That was added by United Launch Alliance just specifically for this flight. That umbilical did not exist before this flight on the Delta IV launch. Again, the launch went extremely well. The vehicle gave us a great ride to space, injected the capsule exactly where it needed to be. The upper stage did all its activities to accelerate the vehicle to the right entry conditions. All of that worked extremely well and went really flawlessly. In terms of kind of first results from the test, nothing major was really learned. One of the video processing units had to be recycled, most likely caused by a radiation event. So we got to understand the radiation environment that the capsule will fly through. The heat shield looks in very good shape as we returned. We removed some plugs from the heat shield out in California yesterday. The capsule is about ready to get on a truck to head towards Florida for more detailed evaluation, and all the data has come off the capsule. The images at apogee are pretty impressive when you look at the small Earth and you see the horizon. I think what was more important was that when you see it through a window where someday crew will be, it makes that tie between a human space flight and a robotic space flight even stronger. This is the capsule, again, successfully floating in the water. That we expected to see 5 airbags deployed in this situation. We see 2. There's something that didn't work in that system. We know the pyros fired. We know the pressure came out of the system, and we'll understand what occurred. But again, overall, just a tremendous testimony to the work that the program has put together, and I look forward to your questions as we move forward in this activity. So thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Chaplain for 5 minutes to present her testimony.
Chairman Palazzo, Ranking Member Edwards, Chairman Smith, and members of the subcommittee. Before I begin, I would like to congratulate NASA on the successful test. It indeed does help demonstrate the design and technologies for the Orion and is an important event. As you know, we have recently reviewed preliminary cost estimates for the systems being discussed today. We performed an in-depth review of the Space Launch System, and we've been covering the Orion program through our annual assessment of NASA's major programs. In conducting this work, at the time we reviewed SLS, the program was approaching a critical milestone known as KDPC, where it makes formal commitments to the Congress in the form of cost and schedule baselines. This gate represents the point at which a program begins full-scale efforts to fabricate the space system and the point at which technical and/or funding problems can have widespread effects. We found that SLS was generally doing a good job at maturing design, keeping requirements stable, and putting a high priority on quality. The program was also acting to manage costs. However, it did take longer than recommended to definitize contracts, which can create conditions for cost growth. The program still faced inherent technical design and engineering risks, as all space programs do, but it was actively managing them in a transparent fashion. However, the program still faced a resource gap in that the agency's funding plan for SLS was insufficient to match requirements to resources for the December 2017 flight test at a high confidence level. The agency's options were largely limited to increasing program funding, delaying the schedule, or accepting a reduced confidence level for the initial flight test. The SLS program calculated the risk associated with insufficient funding through 2017 as 90% likely to occur. Further, it indicated the insufficient budget could push the December 2017 launch date out 6 months and add some $400 million to the overall cost of development. After our report was issued, when NASA established formal baselines for SLS, NASA committed to a launch readiness date of 2018 so that it could have more confidence in meeting this date. In our opinion, this was a good step, as NASA still has low confidence, 30%, that it can meet the earlier date. Going forward, we have short and long-term concerns about NASA's human space exploration programs. In the short term, the programs are entering the most risky phases of development. There are still technical hurdles to overcome, particularly with the Orion spacecraft, which is addressing challenges with the parachute system and heat shield, among others. There's also still considerable development and testing ahead for Orion in terms of the human support systems. Meanwhile, SLS is continuing to pursue the earlier launch date of December 2017. While NASA's urgency is understandable, the schedule for achieving the earlier date, mostly with respect to the core stage, is very aggressive. There's little room to address problems. Moreover, it does not appear that Orion and the ground system can achieve the earlier date. In the long term, we have concerns about the cost estimating for human space exploration programs. NASA's only produced estimates for SLS and the ground system through the first flight test and for Orion through the second flight test. There will still be significant development ahead for SLS after the first flight and significant operations and sustainment costs for all 3 programs. Moreover, there's still uncertainty about missions that will be undertaken after the second test. Without knowing the missions formally, NASA is limited in its ability to plan for the future and is at risk for making choices today that will not make sense later. Affordability for the long haul is a real issue and one this subcommittee has already had hearings on, but to garner the long-term commitment from the Congress and taxpayers that is needed to make this program a success, we need transparent and realistic estimates about the resources that will be needed to achieve the nation's goals for human space exploration. Thank you. This concludes my statement. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
I thank the witnesses for their testimony, reminding the members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair will at this point open the round of questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Gerstenmaier, in the written testimony provided by GAO, Ms. Chaplain states that GAO found that NASA's proposed funding levels had affected the SLS program. SLS program ability to match requirements to resources since its inception. GAO also reported that the SLS program is tracking a $400 million shortfall in funding as its most significant risk. NASA officials have testified multiple times before this committee that the President's budget request was sufficient to keep the SLS and Orion on budget and on schedule. I realize this is a tough question for you to answer because you have to defend the President's budget request, but Congress is ultimately responsible for funding this program and ensuring taxpayer dollars are efficiently spent. But given that NASA has now delayed the initial launch of SLS due to funding pressure, what funding level would keep the 2017 date on track?
Again, I would say that the recent review we did, the programmatic review that Cristina talked about, we committed to a joint confidence level of 70% and a November of 2018 launch, and that's consistent with the budgets that we've submitted to Congress through the administration. So that's a consistent plan. We've been trying to work to an earlier schedule, and that's based on the risk mitigation or the extra funding we've received from Congress. So we've kind of kept both plans in place. So we take the funds that have been given by Congress and use those in an effective manner and try to hold the earliest launch date that we can potentially hold moving forward. We need to be aware of the concerns that GAO brought up and make sure that we don't overly pressure that schedule and try to work too fast and do things that end up in wasting of funds or wasting of resources. So our current planning, we were holding December of 2017. I would say we've now moved off of that date. We'll be somewhere in the 2018 timeframe now with our current planning. And that's just based on the reality of problems that have come along in the program and some uncertainty in funding. So we'll move a little bit into probably with our planning dates into, I would say, maybe June kind of time frame of 2018, and that's still ahead of our commitment consistent with the budget level in November of 2018. It's consistent with the President's budget request. So I would say we're managing in this kind of interesting environment where we get different funding levels. The teams are making tremendous technical progress. SLS is entering into probably one of the more critical phases where they actually go into manufacture of hardware, and we'll see how that goes over the next couple of months here in January, February, and March. But again, I think we've been able to balance the budget needs that we have overall to try to deliver a program as effectively as we can for the nation and for the Congress.
Ms. Chaplain, GAO has noted in the past that the SLS and Orion programs do not have integrated schedules for development and launch. How is NASA currently managing the schedules for these two programs so that they will launch not just on time, but at the same time?
So at present, there's still different dates in the final launches, and Orion is a TBD, you could say right now, because they're about to go into the process where they look at their resources, their schedules, and they set a launch date. At this time, it does not look like they could make 2017, and 2018 is even a challenge in and of itself. So we look forward to seeing what that date really is, and then how do the dates of the other programs align. It's important to plan to a single date as early as you can so that you can align tasks appropriately to meet that date. You don't unnecessarily expend resources trying to meet dates that other people or other systems can't meet. So we'll have to see what happens after this next KDBC cycle for Orion and see how all the dates shake out.
I now recognize Ms. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you for the testimony. Mr. Gerstenmaier, we've all recognized that resources for Orion SLS programs have been constrained, and I think we can acknowledge as well that flat budgets are not optimal for carrying out major development programs like Orion and SLS. But I am impressed with how much progress has been made on these programs given these constraints. And as you know, the committee has had the goal of having SLS and Orion operational at the earliest possible date. You've indicated that, but you've also indicated the slippage based on the budget constraints. We're going to be authorizing NASA again, reauthorizing next year. So I want to understand what the additional progress could be made on the SLS and Orion programs if we were to authorize additional resources, and whether or not the impact on the exploration program, whether there would be any impact if there were inflationary increases as recommended by the National Academy's report of 5% increase, say. And would a sustained increase of this kind of magnitude be sufficient to accelerate the progress that you've described for projected launch dates for EM1 and 2, or would it only be enough to reduce the risk of those dates being pushed even further to the right? I guess I'm just trying to figure out what would get us back to a 2017 target. You seem to indicate that it's not just resources, but you know, even Ms. Chaplain acknowledges that the 2018 dates are at risk as well because of the uncertainty around budget constraints.
Okay, again, I think one thing that could be very helpful to us is get some stability in understanding what the budget is. It's difficult for the programs to plan for potentially what could be a congressional budget versus the administration budget, to get some agreement between the administration and Congress so we know what to plan for in terms of budget would be helpful to us overall, as well as the absolute level. In terms of the technical work, again, I think we've really probably moved off of December 2017 when I look at the work, so I don't think funding will pull us back to that date. I also respectfully have a difference of opinion with GAO. I think it's perfectly fine to complete one of these programs ahead of the others. They don't need to all sync up at exactly the same time. If you think about when you take a vehicle to launch down at the Kennedy Space Center, typically the rocket is ready to go well before the payload is, then the payload comes later. And I think it's actually to our advantage to have some difference in schedules between those. So I think SLS coming first, having the ground systems ready in Florida, and then Orion showing up at the third place is perfectly fine. It's not going to waste resources on if EM1 is complete. If SLS is ready to go fly, we'll be beginning to work on the next core for the second flight of SLS. So that workforce will transition immediately from the EM1 activity to EM2. So there's not a need to have all these programs synced up. So I think we need to be careful and think about that. If we put that extra constraint in where I have to sync all these programs up and match all these schedules, I think that puts another burden in that can make an inefficiency. So again, I think, again, from a technical standpoint, we're probably in 2018 somewhere with SLS in the first part with the funding levels we've seen. We've made the commitment in the KDPC activity to November of 2018. Ground Ops is in June of 2018 with our commitment, and we're in the process of doing the Orion evaluation now to pick a date for Orion.
Thank you. And, you know, some have criticized the SLS and Orion program as kind of a rocket and spacecraft without a mission. We've set a long-term goal of a House-passed NASA Authorization Act of 2014 of sending humans to Mars, and we need a roadmap from NASA of the best way to get there, and it seems to me that now is the time for that. What role do you see SLS and Orion have in reaching that goal, and when will we have a strategy for getting there?
I think both SLS and Orion play a key role in that strategy described. SLS is the heavy lift launch vehicle, is that we need that kind of ability to launch that much mass to go do a Mars-class mission. Orion will have to return at velocities similar to what you saw in the flight test, actually higher from at least lunar return velocities, which most capsules have not. So those two components are really critical to our Mars strategy. There's others that need to be added, a habitation module. And we're actually using Space Station today to buy down risk on the human performance and how well systems work. So I think it was talked about the life support system of Orion. It's actually being tested on Space Station today. So we're actually getting a chance to see how the amine swing bed operations work on board Space Station. So we can use all these pieces to continue to advance us towards Mars. But I don't think there's any question that these two pieces fit squarely in any plan for Mars activity.
So we should just set aside that criticism, right?
Yes.
Thank you.
I now recognize Mr. Brian Stein from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on this very important committee. Thank you to our witnesses providing testimony today. It's an honor to be with you and certainly hear your testimony. Gene Cernan was the last man to walk on the moon. He took off the moon December 17th, 1972, 3 years before I was born. He was a naval aviator, a naval officer. He was an aeronautical engineer, an electrical engineer, a fighter pilot, a test pilot, and an astronaut. He and so many others that accomplished that pinnacle feat never went back to the moon. And I think that is a tragedy and certainly something that this committee needs to be aware of. It hasn't happened in my lifetime. My parents remember exactly where they were the first time it happened with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. This committee, before I got here, and certainly Congress as a whole, commissioned a report that cost $3.2 million. They spent 18 months. It was a group of individuals led by Governor Mitch Daniels, and they came up with a report. It's called Pathways to Exploration. And one thing that I thought was telling in this report is they talk about a horizon goal. What is the horizon goal for NASA? And their horizon goal, according to them, NASA's horizon goal ought to be Mars. And of course, there are stepping stones, pathways to get to land a human on Mars and bring humans home from Mars. And interestingly, it says the current program to develop launch vehicles for spacecraft for flight beyond LEO cannot provide the flight frequency required to maintain competence and safety. I'm going to read that again. Cannot provide the flight frequency required to maintain competence and safety. I took a trip down to Houston. I visited the Johnson Space Center. I talked to them about SLS. Of course, everybody was looking forward to the first launch. Was going to be December of 2017. Now we're hearing 2018. But what was interesting is what the follow-on launch after that was going to be. It was going to be a human launch, and it was going to be in 2021. And my initial reaction as a Navy pilot, remember, Gene Cernan and these guys inspired a guy like me. Even though I hadn't been born yet, I read about these folks. They became heroes of mine and inspired a guy like me to join the United States Navy, to become a pilot. It was aspirational. This is the kind of benefit that this has to the United States of America. And they said 2017 would be the first launch, 2018 could be what it slips to, and then ultimately we're going to launch a manned Orion mission in 2021. Now, it would appear that would have to slip as well. But my initial reaction was we're going to go 4 years without a launch. And then we're going to put men in the vehicle and women in the vehicle and send them into space. My question for you, Mr. Gerstenmaier, sorry, my name is Bridenstine, so I live with the same problem. My question for you is, do you agree with this assessment that current program to develop launch vehicles and spacecraft for flight beyond LEO cannot provide the flight frequency required to maintain competence and safety? Do you agree with that?
We're looking very closely at those concerns. First of all, I would say that the fact that EM1 is moved into 18 doesn't mean that EM2 has moved also. We'll continue to look at ways of holding that. We're trying to look at building a system that we can fly repeatedly and fly for reasonable cost, and we still owe answers to GAO on those activities. Our goal is once we fly crew in 21, we would like to fly at roughly a flight rate of about once per year. And we're off analyzing that once per year flight rate to see if we can achieve that within our budgets, and we think if does that provide enough frequency of flight that it answers those safety concerns. And we're off analyzing both of those activities right now. So our intent would be to take this period between the first uncrewed flight of Orion to deep space on the SLS, and then the second flight with crew, and then follow that with roughly one flight per year after that.
Do you agree that the horizon goal of the United States ought to be landing humans on Mars?
Yes. And the way we see it at NASA is we see three phases. There's what we call the Earth-reliant region, which is space station, which we use today to test out systems like I described. We also understand how the human body performs in microgravity. We'll do a one-year expedition next year with crew members to see that the human can tolerate the kind of duration in microgravity to go to Mars. Then we see the next region of space, the proving ground of region of space. That's around the moon. That's where we're now days away from return. We can test the systems, look at orbital mechanics. We can see deep space radiation. We can do rendezvous without communications to the ground. We can verify and validate the concepts that will be needed to take us eventually to Mars. Then the last phase is Earth independent, or the Mars ready phase. And that's this horizon goal you described. But we think we have, at a macro level, an orderly process beginning in low Earth orbit, going to cislunar space, and then eventually moving on to the Mars-class mission. And
Mr. Chairman, if you'll entertain me for just a few seconds here, I'd like to ask one last question, which is the report here that we commissioned, $3.2 million, 18 months, a lot of experts, they indicate that given our flat funding for the Human Spaceflight Directorate, that we're not going to accomplish that mission of getting to Mars. Given where we are with flat funding, do you agree with that assessment?
we're going to need some funding level above flat funding.
Would you be willing to come back and provide us what kind of funding level is necessary in order to accomplish the objective?
We can provide that, and we can take that for the record and describe that to you. Again, it's going to be a function of the time frame, and the time frame is driven not only by the funding requirement, but it's also by, have we gained enough experience in cislunar space? Have we brought down enough technical risk? Are we ready to take that next step? So there's several components. It's more than just a budget discussion. There's also the technical speed and the assurance of what we can learn during this period moving forward.
And that obviously would require more flight frequency than what we're currently getting.
Potentially, yes.
The gentleman's time has expired. We may have a second round of questions.
Thank you, sir.
The member would like to. At this time, I recognize Mrs. Bonamici for 5 minutes, or 6 or 7.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much to the witnesses for being here today. It's really a pretty exciting time for the U.S. space program. I know that my colleagues and I all watched this Orion test launch with great interest, and I want to also join my colleagues who congratulate NASA, Lockheed Martin, United Launch Alliance, and everyone who participated in this test flight. I heard from some of my constituents who really applauded this, saw this as a big step in our leadership in space, and that comes as welcome news as we're trying to inspire and spark interest in the next generation of young scientists. In our previous space subcommittee hearings, we've talked about the challenge of communicating the importance of NASA's work and mission to our constituency who support the mission with their hard-earned tax dollars. And as Mr. Bridenstine was saying, we have a lot of people who are inspired, looking back to the Apollo missions and the moon landing. But that public outreach is really important, and I noticed that you gave us a publication here that it takes a country that talks about all the places across the country where the parts and pieces were supplied and purchased, and that shows a broad range of states and businesses, I'm sure, that participated in that. That kind of thing is important to convince our constituents of the importance economically as well. I want to make sure Mr. Bridenstine saw the Congressman on Board picture in this publication too, because you have some of our congressmen pictured in there. Also, I know that the budget challenges and the lack of certainty is very, very important. And Mr. Gerstenmaier, you talked about that need for stability. And it's certainly something that we talk about here on a regular basis, that certainty in decision-making and long-term thinking is so important, especially more so for NASA than perhaps many of the other decisions that we make here. And also we know about the importance of safety, acknowledging, as we all know, that space exploration involves risk. There are safety concerns, and I know that NASA does a lot to address those. So, Mr. Gerstenmaier, some have said that outfitting the Orion with the necessary life support equipment on the first crewed mission will cause the spacecraft to be overweight. So should we be concerned about that? What options does NASA have to mitigate this possibility?
Again, if the flight test we just flew, the next flight of Orion will be significantly lighter. We've done a major redesign of some of the structures to actually lower the weight of Orion. That wasn't easy to make those changes, but they've done that. We've also are starting, as I described earlier, testing some of the life support systems on board space stations, so we'll know how much they will actually weigh, and some of those systems are in place. So I think we have a sound approach to address the concerns that you raised. We know what it will take to add the life support system, and we'll make sure that it can be added and still not exceed the mission weight.
Thank you. And then also, Mr. Gerstenmaier, I want to follow up on your response to Ms. Edwards' question. You know, we tend to focus on the SLS and Orion when we think of the exploration program, but I want to talk a little bit more about the ground infrastructure at the Space Center, which is also undergoing some significant development to support the SLS and Orion launches. I know there's been work on the mobile launcher, the tower, the vehicle assembly building, the Launch Pad 39B underway. So where does that ground infrastructure work stand relative to the progress being made on SLS and Orion? Are they in sync so that they'll be ready at the same time?
Yeah, again, I think you saw in the video a lot of activity that's going on down in Florida. That work is in progress. We completed the KDPC review for ground systems, and it shows a 70% confidence level for that equipment to be ready in Florida to support a launch in, I think, June of 2018. So it's on schedule to move forward. It has challenges that needs to be worked as well. And again, I would stress I don't see that all these activities have to line up. Even if SLS is ready a little bit early and the ground system isn't fully there, it's still the right thing to do to move the rocket down to Florida and begin checking out umbilical interfaces to see how it's going to fit with the launch tower, to see how it'll fit with the launch pad. That still fits from an overall schedule standpoint. So there's not a disconnect in the schedule. Even though everything doesn't arrive at precisely the same time, it's perfectly appropriate to have one component arrive before.
Thank you. And I'm going to squeeze one more question in here. As demonstrated by the House-passed NASA authorization of 2014, there's a strong sentiment for NASA to have a policy on termination liability that really maximizes the use of appropriated funds to make progress in meeting those established technical goals and schedule milestones. So how is NASA currently handling potential termination liability for SLS and Orion?
It's actually not a NASA policy. We believe it's part of the Anti-Defamation Act, where the termination liability is required by all agencies to be handled in a similar manner to which the agency does. So, that's where we are. So it's not unique to NASA and unique to what we've done in the past.
Thank you very much, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now recognize Mr. Rohrabacher from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. It's vitally important that we have a responsible oversight of the various NASA projects that are the responsibility of this subcommittee. Many of us were very skeptical about this SLS commitment when it was made. We said there would be funding problems. I had no idea the funding problems would come on so quickly. And, sir, you noted that you said the funding levels now are interesting. Interesting? They're not interesting. They're insufficient. Insufficient to reach your goals. And why are they insufficient? Because we didn't have enough money for this project to begin with. Am I correct in assuming that there are large commitments of finances that will be necessary to develop other technologies that are yet to be developed for this spacecraft, for the SLS, to move forward on its mission to Mars? And we don't even know if those expensive technology development projects will succeed. To say we've got the cart before the horse is an understatement. And there is an expense to this, and I hope my colleagues on this subcommittee understand that with a $10 billion, and that's a minimum expenditure that we're talking about here, in developing this monstrous rocket project that won't have a real mission until we're ready to go to Mars, which could be 2 decades or 3 decades from now, depending on if we can actually ever get over the technological hurdles that we haven't gotten over yet, that by doing that, we have committed ourselves not to do a bunch of other things, not to identify all the near-Earth objects that could be hitting the Earth and murdering billions of people from some object hitting the Earth, much less setting up a system of how we can deflect a near-Earth object. We're not going to have that because we're going to have a big, huge rocket that we can be so proud of that won't even have a mission for 2 decades. We're not going to be building ways to deflect those rockets. We're not going to be building a way and technology developing a way, Mr. Chairman, to clear space debris. Space debris is going to end up strangling humankind's involvement in space in order to improve the condition of human beings, which is a good investment to make, not an investment in a huge rocket that doesn't have a mission for 20 years. And we basically have canceled, just even recently, we canceled this solar cell project. We're not going to have a refueling system in space that could incredibly increase our abilities to do things in space. And basically, we could be perfecting our ways of repairing satellites. All of these things are going to be defunded because we're spending billions of dollars on a rocket that may not fly to Mars 2 decades from now. As I say, to claim this is the cart before the horse is an understatement that I have ever heard. And we're already having budget crisis talks about it right now. Because what you're telling us today is that things aren't going to work out with the budget that we got. It's not just interesting, it's insufficient to achieve the goal. And even if we do then pump more money into the SLS project, we've pumped it into a project that is providing a rocket that will be useless to us for 2 decades, as compared to all those other things we could be done in space. Mr. Chairman, we need to be serious. We need to be responsible. We should not be blaming the people at NASA and our professionals in the executive branch. We made a wrong decision when we went down this road. And I think that, unfortunately, the American people and the people of the world are going to pay for it, not just out of their pockets with money, but out of things that we could have been doing in space that would have been so beneficial to the human race. With that, and I guess you got 30 seconds to answer that, but go right ahead. Is there any refutation you have of that observation? Please feel free. My feelings won't be hurt.
My only comments would be we have I can't think of any real major technical challenges in terms of SLS development.
How about the radiation challenge with going to Mars? Have we met that?
We've not met that.
Yeah, we've got a whole bunch of those type. I'm not talking about the challenges of developing the SLS. I'm talking about the challenges of once we have it and we spent those billions of dollars, whether it's going to be able to go to a mission, which is what it's supposedly for. We don't even know how we're going to land on one of those moons on Mars yet, do we? We don't have the exact system set up and how much that's going to cost us to develop it and how it's going to be put on the rocket. We have a list of these technological achievements that are necessary for this rocket to have been useful in any way, and we're not even halfway there. Please feel free.
And then the only other thing I would add is we are doing some activities in the areas you described. On board Space Station, we have a refueling demonstration package on the board outside of Space Station where we've actually robotically serviced the outside of a satellite and transferred some propellant back and forth. We're also looking at cryogenic servicing on station. There's a package on board station.
Those are the good things.
And then we also have solar electric propulsion and as part of the asteroid redirect mission. And we're also looking at techniques where we can use a gravity tractor to deflect some asteroids. So
they're wonderful, but let me just note, all of those projects were financed in budgets before the SLS became part of our budget. All of those things that you said we now are testing, they were done in the research and development stage long before we started taking all of our money out to put it in one big rocket. And we don't even know, do we, whether we're going to have the money to finish all those projects that you just talked about in their development, because this is now at $10 billion, and by all of the experience we've had, it's likely to go up to double that by the time we finish with this rocket. And I say finish, that's just when the rocket's ready to take off for the first time. This was a rotten decision on the part of this committee. It's not your fault. You're good soldiers, and you're doing your very best with what the members of Congress are giving you. We have given you an undoable task, and thank you very much for your hard work.
I now recognize Mr. Posey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad that didn't stop Apollo. We're all excited about the Orion launch, Mr. Gerstenmaier, and I think we are seeing more public awareness of SLS now, and that's something we all look forward to. Can you take a moment following up on Congresswoman Bonamici's comments to discuss the importance of another special aspect of the SLA program, and that's the exploration ground systems. I'm sure many folks are not up to speed on the importance of the ground systems aspects of the SLS.
Yeah, the ground systems team play a critical role in the Space Launch System. They're working on the mobile launch platform to interface with the rocket to provide propellant to that to fuel the rocket, and they'll actually launch of it. They're also working on a launch pad. Significant amount of work has gone into the pad. We've looked forward to trying to lower operations costs, so there's many activities on the launch pad. It's a clean pad, which should help lower launch costs. We also have the firing room down at the Kennedy Space Center. That's going in place with a lot of software development activities there. We've also made the launch pad a multi-purpose launch pad, so it can not only support SLS, but it can support other rockets. So the fiber cables that run out to that launch pad can support multiple rockets launching off of that pad, which is a good thing. So there's a tremendous amount of work going on at the Kennedy Space Center. The recovery activities that occurred for the EFT-1 flight, those were all managed out of the Kennedy Space Flight Center by the ground system folks that worked with the Navy and the Anchorage to pick up the capsule. So again, the ground support activities, and as you saw in the video, are absolutely critical to what we're doing with the heavy lift launch vehicle and the Orion processing and manufacturing.
Thank you. Following up a little bit, can you explain the thinking behind the President's budget request calling for funding increases for exploration ground system in the years 2016 to 2019, and what happens if these funding targets are not met?
Again, we need the funding levels that we've requested to meet the schedules that we've put forward, or there'll be slippages and activities as I've described.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you can discern from the comments of Representatives Don Edwards and Dana Rohrabacher, the mission for SLS and Orion is certainly a concern for this committee and for Congress as a whole. Mr. Gerstenmaier, it seems that you're uniquely situated as Associate Administrator for Human Exploration Operations to answer some of these questions about SLS's missions. It is one thing for us to test whether SLS and Orion components work. It is another thing to actually give SLS and Orion a substantive, a real mission, such as going to the moon or Mars, capturing an asteroid, space station resupply if that's what's necessary, or whatever. In your opinion, what should SLS's first real mission be?
I think the SLS and Orion's first mission will be to this proving ground of space that I described around the moon. We call it cislunar space in the vicinity of the moon. That's a very necessary step for us to move forward as we push human presence into the solar system. So it's a place for us to hone skills, to understand techniques, to prepare much as the early flights did in Mercury and Gemini to prepare for the Apollo activities. These flights around the moon will help us prepare to get ready to go do these Mars missions decades later. But the first flights will be to the vicinity of the moon. The rocket is capable of doing that. Orion is capable of doing that without any additions, and we can learn the skills, bring our level of expertise up to where the risk is then appropriate to take bolder steps beyond the cislunar space.
For clarity, you're saying around the moon. does that include landing on the moon or simply going around the moon?
We didn't, in our budget, we don't have funding for landing on the moon. We just have in the vicinity of the moon. We use potentially the gravity of the moon to help with doing trajectory design as we would look for Mars. We have an international community that's very interested in potentially doing lunar activities, and maybe we can partner with the international community if they choose to develop the lander. But in our concept, we don't have funding in our plans for a lander to the moon.
Okay, after we go around the moon, what should be the second mission of SLS?
Again, I think it's going to take more than one mission around the moon to build these skills that we need to.
Okay, after all the around the moon missions, what should be the second mission for SLS?
Then we're ready to start heading towards Mars. And whether we go to an asteroid as an intermediate destination or we go all the way to the vicinity of Mars and go to potentially a moon of Mars, those are things yet to be decided.
Can you please give me a timetable sequencing of what you believe is appropriate for NASA and SLS with respect to the missions you've just enumerated?
Again, we kind of think of them in broad terms, so that the decade of the 20s to the 30s, that's this proving ground region that I described to you, where we learn these capabilities between 2020 and 2030. Then beyond 2030, we're ready to go do these other activities to an asteroid potentially in its native orbit, or potentially all the way to the moons of Mars or to Mars in that time frame.
So for clarity, for the next decade or two, you're talking about circling the moon. And then roughly 2 decades thereabouts in the 2030s, you're talking about then we can think about going to Mars. Is that your testimony?
We need, it's not just circling the moon, we're actually doing activities around the moon with the intent that we're building the skills, understanding the hardware, understanding the techniques, understanding the environment that we're operating in, that prepares us to go to distances as far as Mars with a reasonable risk assessment.
Is additional funding needed to speed up the mission platform that you've just expressed?
Additional funding can help with that activity.
How much additional funding would be required, by way of example, to speed up the Mars part of the mission scope to somewhere in the 2020s or around 2030?
Again, I think I'd like to take that question for the record. It's more than just funding. It's not only funding, but it's also how long it takes us to actually get proficient at these skills to go take that next step. And to give you a real answer, I need to spend some time with our teams looking at how long we think those activities take, and then back into the funding discussion that you had.
Well, I hope you can understand this subcommittee's concerns when it took us less than a decade not only to go around the moon, but to land on the moon under Apollo. And with what I'm hearing you testify to, it's going to be 10 to 20 years to just go around the moon, not actually land on the moon. So those kinds of timing issues are of concern. And Mr. Chairman, if I could ask Ms. Chaplain a question, is that okay?
That's okay.
Thank you.
Proceed.
At this past year's hearing on the President's FY 2015 budget request for NASA, Administrator Bolden indicated that providing more funding for SLS would not be helpful for completing the first version of SLS by 2017. However, your testimony states that the, quote, top risk, end quote, for meeting its deadline for EF1 in December 2017 is insufficient funding. Would you please explain this discrepancy, and would additional funding make meeting the 2017 test flight possible, or at least more likely?
So the cost risk we identified in our report comes from NASA's own documents and was also raised by their standing review board. So there was indeed a very high risk that there was not enough money to help meet the 2017 date. That said, as Mr. Gerstenmaier has already testified, just putting in money now won't help you get there any quicker. There's a lot of sequential activities that are needed to get some of the critical path items done for SLS, like the core stage. The money at this point would be helping out with reserve and possibly doing testing and some other activities that couldn't be done earlier and bringing them forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Gerstenmaier and Ms. Chaplain.
I now recognize Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Part of this is going to be a little bit of a follow-up on both what Dana and Congressman Brooks were. Ms. Chapman, help me get my head a bit from your report, and I'm assuming much of what went into your report was actually taken from the documents from NASA and others. And then when we start to look at timelines, and this, I'll let you do it as a personal opinion, because you've been doing this for a while. How short are we financially? And then I'll go to Mr. Gerstenmaier and ask how short we are technologically. But if I came to you and said, hey, here's the robustness of what we're trying to do. I'm looking at, a number of tables that have, all these moving pieces and projects, and I came to you and said, here's where we are over the next 20 years, here's what we're seeing Congress's appetite for funding. What's an honest number of shortfall?
I think there's various numbers to pay attention to here. First are the kind of short-term numbers laid out in the documents for SLS and Orion. For SLS, they ranged anywhere from 400 to 900 million, but with pushing out the date and doing some other things, those numbers have been reduced. There's still a funding risk for Orion that's considerably high.
And I'm actually after something for the robustness of the system. Is that just Orion itself? Is that also ground control, personnel costs? I mean, every step you need to make this work instead of just this individual silo. Has that been actually looked at through the totality of the system that's required?
Right. So the problem we identified in a different report on cost estimating is we don't really know the total number now of how much it's going to cost to do everything we're looking for them to do. And second, we don't know really what the pathway is. And that pathway has a big effect on numbers. Like Mr. Gerstenmaier mentioned, a landing system. It's very costly. There's not money to do it right now. If you want to move things up, you have to pay for a landing system. How much is that? So it's very, very important to kind of lay out the roadmap now and see all the different pieces that you need. We don't know that, and we don't have cost estimates beyond the first test for some of the systems.
And Ms. Chapman, you understand the sort of when we're looking at CBO type numbers, we have here's our best guess, here's our optimistic, and here's when we're in trouble. I mean, sort of those variants, and we understand for every step of technology, every additional incremental piece of timeout, the variance grows because it's unknown. But we're trying in a number of discussions to get some idea what the exposure is, and are we about to cannibalize everything else? Mr. Gerstenmaier, technologically, if I came to you and said the goals that are here on the timeline over the next 10 years, 20 years, where do we have things where we don't actually have the technology yet, but we're working on it?
I would say the biggest technology areas we need to work on are we need to work on radiation for the human being and look at radiation shielding. We can only shield so much, but I think, again, that's a manageable risk, but will there ultimately be some risk associated with galactic cosmic radiation that we'll have to deal with on humans? The other big thing is if we're going to Mars, the entry, descent, and landing into the Mars, to the surface of Mars is a big technology leap. Today we've landed rovers on the order of 1 metric ton to the surface of Mars. For a human class mission, we're going to have to land about 20 times that, at least 20 metric tons. We don't know exactly how to do that. We did some tests in Hawaii to go look at some inflatable reentry heat shields. We're working on that technology. And then kind of going back a little bit to the other questions about Mr. Brooks and why we're not sprinting to the moon like we did before. I'm really building systems that are like modern manufacturing. So the equipment we're putting in down at Stennis is going to allow us to have a system that can be reproduced and flown multiple times for minimum cost. Okay. So we're spending extra time, I would say, to prepare a system that is affordable in the long term. GAO wants more details on that. We need to provide that information to them, but we're looking forward that we're not just building a single system that sprints to a destination. We're building an infrastructure that allows us to have sustained presence beyond low Earth orbit.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, as you've had a number of conversations with staff and the rest of us, we still think there's so much variability, exposure, and costs. And we all know what's about to hit us in the entitlement crisis over the next decade, cost-wise. What's going to happen to future federal government spending. Somewhere here we're going to have a much more robust and a much more brutally honest of what we have cash for and what we don't. With that, I yield back.
At this time, we'll go into our second round of questions. Mr. Gerstenmaier, when did NASA first begin tracking the $400 million risk identified by GAO?
Probably that got identified back in 2013, 2014 timeframe. I would say if you asked my teams now, they would say that that $400 million risk, because of the appropriations we've received in 2014 and the pending bill that we saw last night, that $400 million risk will be retired.
Well, if you said in 2013, I mean, we had Administrator Bolden sitting where you were telling us that if we threw another $300 million at SLS and Orion, we wouldn't even notice it. I mean, it wasn't needed at that time. So you recognize this risk. If you'd have come to us, say, a year ago, or when you first started tracking it, because it feels like we're just finding out about this risk, this $400 million, since the GAO's report has come out. And you're telling me NASA's known about this for a much longer period than that?
It was in our earlier reports that the GAO picked up, and it's one of many risks. We carry technical risks, programmatic risks, and budget risks. And it was, again, to meet a specific launch date. And again, we've moved the launch date, which gives us some margin as well. And then we've also we actually know what the budgets are now in 2014. We'll know what the budget is when it gets approved here in 15. Those remove that uncertainty, and that lowers the level of the risk. So as we identify those, we carry those and bring those forward as soon as we can.
And are you going to be matching your expenditure of funds based on Congress's budget or the President's request, which has been quite lower than what Congress has been appropriating for the past several years?
This is the dilemma we have, right? So the reality is the program plans to some variance between those two limits that you just described.
And if you'd have come to us for, say, additional funding a year or 2 years ago, would you have been able to mitigate the risk or buy down the technical risk, or would we still be having the same conversation that the test is going to slip to the right, regardless of the amount of funding that may have been able to appropriate to the program?
And that's a very difficult question to answer. And the other thing that's hard for me is that I look at human spaceflight as the total, which is SLS, Orion, also commercial crew, commercial cargo, and International Space Station. I see human spaceflight as really the combination of all those activities. We're using Space Station today to buy down a lot of risks for Mars. So I have to look at a balancing across all of those programs. I can't optimally fund any one of those programs. So I effectively balance across those and the risk, and I try to weigh the budget and the technical risk associated with those programs to give what we think is the best approach to deliver hardware for the lowest cost for the Congress and the taxpayers.
I now recognize Ms. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for a second round of questions. I want to go back to something that I raised earlier, and it is regarding the recommendation by the national academies about a 5% inflationary increase in the budget. And although I understand that for the specific purpose of looking at 2017 slippage to 2018, that's not what we're talking about, but I want to know about the program. And would it be useful for both the administration to recommend and Congress to incorporate this margin that the national academies has recommended, so that we, over a period of time, that we're not looking at the questions that are being raised today? Just give us some guidance. Okay, flip a coin. Yes, Ms. Chaplain.
I would just add that that's not the first time a recommendation like that has been made. It was made at the tail end of the Constellation Program by the Augustine Commission, and I think they recommended about $3 billion additional a year, which was pretty significant, and that was their view of what was needed over a number of different paths that you would take, not just the Constellation path. They mentioned a path similar to what is being done here.
And that would provide a lot more stability than what we're seeing now, wouldn't it?
Yes, and the other thing to remember is programs like this have spikes in terms of their funding needs. So Constellation Program itself, when that recommendation was made, was asking for about $3 billion a year, but in their budget they went up to as much as $7 billion a year in terms of their needs. So there's spikes depending on what you're developing and when activities come up.
I want to just ask really briefly, in the Department of Defense large-scale programs, they don't go through this. They set out, kind of a goal. It crosses Congresses. They know that there's a difference in these kind of large-scale development programs. Why is it that we're funding a scientific program that has a lot of uncertainties year by year, and in some cases a few months by a few months? Don't we actually end up wasting way more money over the long term by doing that than just setting out a goal of making sure that we fund this program in the most robust way possible across Congresses so that the goal is achieved? Why isn't there modeling for these large-scale science programs the same way that there's that kind of modeling for defense programs? And has GAO ever analyzed that and what the impact would be to the success of the programs?
We've never analyzed NASA funding compared to DoD funding, but we do know when funding's stretched out, the problems you're describing do occur. It's not like all the DoD systems don't experience some kind of instability. It's rare when Congress is trying to give more money than what they're asking for. Sometimes there's a reverse case where Congress gives a little less. But with programs with a lot of schedule pressure and everybody recognizes
and experimentation.
Yes, but with programs where everybody recognizes a date is important to deliver, there tends to be more support funding-wise, and it tends to be more stable.
Mr. Gerstenmaier, do you have a comment about that?
No, I think, again, the discussion is good. Some understanding and stability in budget would be helpful. At least matching inflation would be helpful. But again, I think the problem is we deal, as you described very succinctly, that with essentially a year budget, sometimes months, we throw in furloughs and other things just to make, and those are real impacts to us. When we stood down effectively for 2 weeks where we couldn't do any work on Orion during that time, and how do you plan for that in a programmatic sense is extremely difficult. So it's a tribute to my teams that take this environment that is very dynamic and figure out a way to make as significant progress as we can, not waste funds, not use funds in an inappropriate manner. But it's difficult for the teams to do that, but they've done a fairly good job, as we've seen through this activity. It could be eased if we got some more certainty on what that.
Mr. Chairman, I am on a mission that we have to think differently about the way that we do these large-scale programs. We faced it with James Webb. We're looking at it here with SLS. Orion, this is just really not smart. And at the end of the day, the technologies expire, the technologies change over a period of 10 or 20 years as we're stretching things out. And then it's like starting all over again. And I just think it is about the dumbest way to do science. And with that, I yield.
Ms. Edwards, I think there's several people that would agree with you. I now recognize Mr. Bridenstine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Edwards, I do agree with you, and your comments are certainly well recognized on both sides of the aisle, so thank you for that, and we'd like to work with you on how we can remedy this. We just had a quick question about the international implications of our direction for human spaceflight.
the report that Ms. Edwards referenced from the national academies indicated that if we were to do this asteroid redirect mission, we would be not in alignment with the international community, most of which is focused on getting to the moon, namely the lunar surface, and then on to Mars, and that this misalignment, according to the report, again headed by Governor Mitch Daniels, indicated that this misalignment could actually result in us spending a whole lot of money on dead-end technologies rather than actually accomplishing the objective of getting to the moon. Mr. Gerstenmaier, could you address that?
Yeah, I would say the Global Exploration Roadmap is the plan that the international partner community has agreed to, along with NASA, as the basic framework of how we want to head forward. I think in that roadmap, Mars is a horizon destination, as we've described. The internationals, as the report describes, have a stronger interest in the moon. The asteroid redirect mission places this asteroid in the vicinity of the moon, which is consistent with what the international partners would want to do. The SLS rocket, the Orion capsule, they fit very well in this lunar activity, in this proving ground I described. If the partners then have a desire to do lunar activities, we could very easily work with the partners and support that activity. The asteroid redirect mission also fits in the long-term goal of what we want to do. We believe for a Mars-class mission, we need solar electric propulsion to move large masses to the vicinity of Mars. We're going to move essentially a 50 metric ton asteroid through space. That could be the same cargo we're delivering to Mars. So that space tug that we're building for the asteroid redirect mission is a piece of the tug that would be used for the human class missions to Mars. So it fits in that other architecture moving forward. So it's not a diversion, it's not from our overall goal. So we look at each piece we're developing within human spaceflight. We look how it fits in terms of international partner needs. We look how it fits in our horizon goal of Mars needs. And we only move projects that we can continue to keep moving forward in that direction. We don't want to spend resources on items that are one-of-a-kind use in items, much as the report said.
Do you know offhand specifically which technologies they're talking about that would be dead-end technologies as we pursue this path?
I think we didn't have a chance to discuss with the committee significantly how we were going to use this cargo capability for Mars. I think if we would have had a chance to describe that with them, they would not have seen that as a dead-end capability. And so I think we needed to have more dialogue with the committee. We ran out of time towards the end. They didn't get a chance to see some of our latest thinking of how all these pieces fit together towards the ultimate Mars horizon goal.
Okay.
But I can't judge what their answer would have been.
Last question. We're down to about a minute and a half. We noticed that the WARN Act, notices went out for the WARN Act recently associated with the SLS program. Can you explain why, given the fact that we're spending more money than expected and everybody seemed to be telling us that things were ahead of schedule and we're spending more than what was anticipated, why did these WARN Act notices go out?
One reason for the WARN Acts was again, they're issued by the contractors based on the activity and the direction we give them. There's a natural change in the development life cycle of the SLS. We're essentially ramping down on the heavy design phase where there's a lot of engineering, a lot of drawing development, analysis kind of activities. That now is terminating naturally. Now we're getting ready to go manufacture, so they're going to be buying long lead items, large aluminum forgings. The work occurs down at the Michoud facility down off by New Orleans to actually do manufacturing. So we're shifting from design to manufacturing, and during that shift there is a natural ramp down of the skills. The overall workforce will come up, but it'll come up in other areas, and it'll show up in materials. It will not show up in personnel. So this is a piece of that WARN Act activity is supporting this natural progression from design to manufacturing.
Roger that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Breinstein. Two stories below us is the House Armed Services Committee room, and Mr. Breinstein also served on that same committee. And we've had testimony presented to us that the number one threat to America's national security is our national debt. And I'm going to have to say that the number one threat to America maintaining its leadership in space is also going to be our national debt. And many members on both sides of the aisle recognize that we have to address the pending fiscal problem that's going to be facing our nation, and hopefully we can overcome that. Once again, Mr. Gerstenmaier, congratulations to you and your entire team at NASA, to Lockheed Martin and ULA for a very successful, outstanding test flight. And I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for you, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. The witnesses are excused, and this hearing is adjourned.